Hello, everybody, and welcome to our webinar today. We are getting into data. What is it good for? We're so excited to have such a great response and so many people attending today. As we dive into today's webinar, there's just a couple things that I want you all to keep in mind. First, that we're going to be talking about understanding data, sharing data, and the impact of data. But before we get started, there are a couple housekeeping things to keep in mind. So first, please know that we are recording right now. Your camera and microphone will stay off throughout the entire call. And with that in mind, we will be sending you that recording tomorrow via email, as well as your certificate of attendance and any free resources that we discussed today. Today, we do encourage you to chat with us in the chat box. You should be able to ask questions there and interact with each other. We are the interactions company, so we do encourage that participation. But if you have a private question, please use the chat box, or I'm sorry, the Q&A box. So chat box will go to everybody, but if you have something that you just want to ask us privately, please go ahead and submit in the Q&A box. We often encourage you all to get started by sharing where you're from in the chat. And now we're going to go ahead and introduce our guests today. So we are joined by a couple people from Teachstone and as well as Dr. Cersei. So we'll be joined by Dorothy Sanchez and Claudia Perez. They've both been in the early childhood research world for over a decade. Together, they helped develop a power inquiry-based coaching model at the University of Miami and coached infant, toddler, and preschool teachers at early Head Start and Head Start programs across Miami-Dade County. Now they're part of the team working to ensure the services and products Teachstone develops are relevant and meaningful to the diversity of context and communities that we serve. Dr. Cersei holds a doctorate in education, and her research has revolved around brain-based learning assessed by class and its correlation to aggressive behaviors in preschool children. Currently, she is an adjunct faculty member at the Erickson Institute, a professional development provider for teaching strategies, a class affiliate trainer, and a Bureau of Education and Research trainer. She's also the author of a couple books, Push Past It, A Positive Approach to Challenging Classroom Behavior, and her newest book, Elevating Equity, Advice for Navigating Challenging Conversations in Early Childhood from Griffin House Publishing. And we will be discussing those a little bit more at the end. So I've seen in the chat, we have a lot of people from across the country. We've got some people from Florida, which is where I'm located. We have a lot of people from Virginia, where we have a lot of Teachstone presence. So we want you to go ahead now to get this conversation going and share in the chat what word comes to your mind when you hear the word data. And we're starting to see a lot of things coming in. Information is one that's coming in a lot. Evidence, reports, measurable. Yeah. These are all great comments, and we should start thinking about your understanding of interactions throughout this presentation, especially as it involves data. So I'm going to pass it over now to Dorothy to start that conversation.
Hello, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here with you all today. I love seeing all of these different words coming in, and there's a few that are standing out to me, so I'm definitely going to incorporate them as we continue talking. But thank you all so much for joining. And so I'm going to start off by telling us about the continuous quality improvement systems. And so that's really where our data gets to shine. And so when we think about class is a continuous quality improvement system that supports educators in focusing on, measuring, and improving those elements of classroom experiences that matter the most for supporting children's learning and development, right? It's those interactions. And so to have the highest impact on children's development and learning, it is so important that all of the foundational elements of the classroom, right? We're thinking about curriculum, the way that lessons are delivered, the environment, that those are all connected and driven by high quality educator-child interactions. So interactions are really at the heart of great teaching. And so this class CQI system is an intentional and systematic approach that promotes data-driven impact and ongoing progress monitoring. So when we're talking about focus, we are talking about establishing and maintaining a shared focus on creating those high quality experiences for all children through equitable interactions. And so the measure piece, it's mostly when we think about data, right? Measure is the way that we can communicate those aspects of quality and communicate what matters most, those teacher-child interactions. And so then we have improve, which means ongoing feedback loops that support and drive innovation, impact, and data-informed investments. So when we're thinking about data and where that fits in, yes, we think about it in that measure piece, but it really helps to connect all of these parts of this wheel, right? So a data-informed culture is one in which we use data as one of the many, many things that we consider as we are trying to engage in quality improvement efforts, right? So that data helps you continuously reflect, continuously refine your focus, and continuously plan for that ongoing effectiveness. So data really helps you with that focus piece too. It's not just in measure, it's not just improve. It helps us focus on the areas that we really do want to work on, leverage those strengths. Then we can measure that information, and then we can use that information to improve not just those data points, but have comprehensive quality improvement efforts. So we're going to talk a little bit more about how we use that data.
All right. Oh my goodness. So yes, I love just thinking about that focus and how do we get to that focus is really important. So in the chat, you all mentioned words like measure. You talked about reporting and tracking and statistics. And you know what? We're collecting a lot of data, but sometimes that data is not getting used when we're selecting our professional development for teachers. And sometimes it's not getting used at all. So let's ensure that you're using that great data. And that starts with understanding the data that you. So as we think about our data, we have our formal assessment, we have our informal assessment, and then we're going to talk about other data that you can think of. Okay. So, okay, when conducting a formal observation, it's important to keep a classy professional climate in which all data is considered good data. So, okay, what's a formal observation? All right, let's go back. Formal observations are when a reliable, certified class observer comes to conduct cycles of observation. Okay, you guys know a lot about this already, right? They assign a 1 to 7 score in dimension level to indicate whether there's a low, a mid, or a high amount of interaction. They can also jot down some notes while they're observing, right, to capture some of that great context and get some qualitative data. Class is a story. That data tells us the story of our interactions. It's not scary. It's important to understand, for example, the time, the time of day, that's on the class data. Thinking about depending on the day of the week. Oh my goodness, we've all been there. We've been observed on a Monday or before a holiday. So we want to understand all of that rich information, the number of staff present, the number of children present. That context tells you what to do next. It can be really affirming to understand your interactions are more depth at certain activities or at a certain time of day. I've had teachers that, ask more open-ended questions during their read alouds, but then when they turn around during the transition, it's like, get your coat. So it's important to know and be able to target that professional development to notice if your teacher sensitivity or your interactions in terms of like asking those great open-ended questions are at different amounts depending on the time of day. So you'll know at transitions, hey, we're doing some glowing, we got some growth here. And growing as an educator is so important. So that context helps us to understand what we need to think about in terms of professional development going forward. I think we have, yeah. Oh.
Yes. And thanks, Dr. Cersei. So you talked a lot about formal observations. And so another data source that you mentioned is informal observations, which are pretty different from that more formal class observation, right? So that formal class observation could be like 2 hours long, right? It's across multiple cycles throughout the day. And so informal observations are the ones that typically are conducted by a coach or a mentor or anybody that is filling in that role of coach or mentor. So that could be another educator if you have a peer mentor model. And it's an opportunity for that person who's observing just to focus on those skills and behaviors that an educator is actively working on, that's actively trying it out, right? So that could be a 5-minute observation. It could be 15, 20 minutes, depending on what that coach and that educator have decided to focus on together. So just like athletes and sports coaches, right? They need to be in frequent contact with each other, right? Coaches need to be there watching what their athletes are doing. So educational coaches, it's the same sort of model, right? They need to frequently go into their educators' classrooms, observe teachers as they practice specific behaviors, and give them supportive feedback based on those efforts. So that real-time in the field support that's grounded in what educators are currently doing, that type of support is made possible by these informal observations. And we know that depending on your program, you may call these things different names, right? We have informal observations. It could be something like drop-ins, right? Let's say you are an administrator and you are just walking by a classroom and you think, oh, wow, I should go in and schedule some kind of informal observation with my educator. And so you ask them, hey, next week on Tuesday, do you mind if I just drop in for 15 minutes? What would you like me to focus on? And so really helping the coach and the educator choose something to watch and observe helps the coach collect specific objective evidence about what the teacher is saying and doing and how the children are responding in that moment. So informal observations can also give us some data, right? So I saw in the beginning, well, a lot of you think about numbers when you think about data. Data can be more than numbers. It can be qualitative information. It can be the quotes that you heard, the questions that you heard, the ways that children were responding to the educator, right? So you can use that information too from informal observations to reflect, to identify those moments of effectiveness, and to continue planning for ongoing high quality interactions.
Yes. Wow. Oh my gosh, Dorothy. I love that you talked about, athletes, right, needing a coach. Michael Jordan had a coach. Serena Williams has a coach. That coaching is such an important piece of our work. And data is more than just numbers. And I love how it's just such a good reminder. That's how sometimes I got scared of data because I thought about, oh my gosh, here come the numbers. But data is more than that. So let's talk about other forms of data. So my research looked at teachers who had high emotional support, high classroom organization. And honey, they had less incident reports. Is this not what you guys are? You're like, yes, this. So what else? What else can we find out? How can we look at other forms of data, triangulate that data? Honey, all roads lead to data. So things to ask yourself. How does your level of curriculum implementation correlate to your class data? Oh my gosh, how does one piece of data impact another piece of data? I'm about to save you time. Instead of having 10 meetings, you can have one meeting. All centered around interactions, class, and how that impacts all of your work. What about other quality improvement data? How is that aligned with class? So think about, we want to think about all forms of data, but we don't want to disregard building our class culture. So what are those anecdotes that you've gathered from staff about effective interactions? What are they saying? What's happening in the teacher's lounge at the water cooler? What are they talking about? That's data. And then also assessing morale. Give feedback. Are you open to getting feedback if you're a coach or a leader? When elevating equity, I discussed how environments can have this parallel process that we can collect data, not just with teachers, but thinking about leaders, thinking about coaching interactions. Yes, absolutely. So there's more data. So things to think about. Is data collaborative, reciprocal, and bidirectional? Okay. Do you have official avenues that staff provide their feedback back to you regularly? You know what? As a coach, as a leader, are you adjusting your interactions to match that data? Are you incorporating that in your program? So, a couple of things to think about. You want to think about how you are invested in the whole educator experience, right? Not just the numbers, everything. And then thinking about that continuous quality improvement, not just for educators, right? But for all of us. Are we all engaged?
Yeah.
So, yeah, oh, Claudia, go take it away.
No, I was just gonna say, Dr. Cersei, that I love that point that you made so much about the bidirectionality, right? It's not just a giving and showing of data. We're also receiving data ourselves all the time, and we have to make sure that we are. And also the way that the data is received by the other person when we have that discussion, that reaction and that delivery is also data for us, right? Like, oh, how did they take that? What's the disposition? What was that reaction? Like, maybe I have to back it up, and maybe there's some other more connection that I need to focus on before focusing on this data that I originally had planned on focusing on. So all of that, and somebody earlier in the chat said overwhelming, right? And it's true, because there's data and information coming in from everywhere. So it's really important that we're intentional about it. But when we think about all those different types of data, there's really two other ways that we could categorize it. So is it individual data or is it program level data? And no matter what type of data it is, we always want to make sure that we're asking ourselves, who are we sharing our class data with, right? Because that determines so much about the how we go about sharing it. So when we think about individual level data, that tends to be a lot more detailed, right? Since we want to paint a full picture to support the work of that one person, and we want to consider them as a whole individual, right? So that's where that coaching individual data lives. And when we think about program level data, that tends to be a lot more aggregated and summarized, since we're trying to look for patterns across several individuals or classrooms to help us really understand how a program is functioning as a whole. So we're going to talk a little bit more about both of those today. So when we think about class individual data, individual class data, like you all said in the chat, right? Like immediately we think about those dimension and domain scores that come from coding a classroom's teacher-child interactions, right? But it's also so important to gather other data from that observation, like the time of day, the number of teachers and children that were present that day, the type of activities that were going on during this morning that we observed, the content areas that were addressed, right? Because those numbers don't have as much meaning until we have this additional information, right? About what was happening that day. That helps us interpret those scores and provide much more meaningful professional development to educators. So when we're sharing some of this class data with educators, it's really important that we ask ourselves, what is this educator's familiarity level with the class tool, right? Because if they're not familiar with the class, then using the names of the indicators and the dimensions is going to leave the teacher feeling pretty lost and overwhelmed. So the good news is that teachers don't need to be fully trained on the class tool for you to have a meaningful conversation with them about their data. And why is that? Because, as you all know, the class dimensions are all linked to an area of development that's important for children, right? So you can use that terminology instead. So instead of saying the data shows high scores in teacher sensitivity, right? You can say something like, the data shows that you make sure that children feel safe and supported in your classroom. That's a lot more understandable and less jargony than using a class term that an educator may not be necessarily familiar with.
Oh my gosh. You know what, Claudia? I really appreciate that you are just breaking this down and making it so easy to digest. And I think that's the key. It can feel overwhelming, but it really isn't. We're not letter of the weeking. We're learning it all at the same time. But you're choosing and being strategic about what's meaningful to that teacher in that moment, right? Or that teaching team. So, a couple things to think about before you're sharing that data, right? Is that always provide the context. Claudia, you mentioned that, what is their understanding? What are the measures? And right, there is a class training primer for teachers that's like that 2-hour training to help them get that baseline support and what they need to know before they're being observed. And I think it's also thinking about being classy every day. It's not just the observation, like having that discussion in very simple terms of like, wow, you were in close proximity to that child, and how did they respond to that? So it's really about keeping it simple, making it meaningful. And again, that context means so much that you not only have to have context of the classroom and the children, but also context of the educators. What are their interests? What are their ways of working? What's important to them in regards to their practice? And then we're going to pair that data with a conversation. And they're going to be excited because that conversation is going to be tailor-made just for them based off of your own observations. We said it's a parallel process. And offering that conversation along with professional development as well. Oh my gosh, just thinking, let's go into more detail about this, about how this may look.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and one more thing to add about the conversation is it's just so important to provide that feedback always in the context of a conversation, because imagine if somebody like your supervisor or somebody would just leave a note on your desk, right, with a couple of numbers and words like low, mid, and high, and you have no idea what exactly those numbers and words mean, right? Like, not the best feeling. That would just create a lot of anxiety. So just always providing that in the context of a conversation. Back to that bi-directional theme that we keep bringing up of you're providing this data, but you're also asking the educator or whoever it is that's receiving the data for their thoughts. Like, how do they feel about it? What are their reactions? Is there something that they want to add about that day that might provide some really helpful insight and would give even more meaning and understanding and context to this data that maybe you didn't already know? So regardless of whether you are sharing scores or ranges, I know different programs do it differently, but regardless of how you're sharing that data, always do it through a conversation where you're creating that space in which the educator feels comfortable asking questions, they feel comfortable expressing their feelings, and where you're assuring them that you value the hard work that they do every single day and your intention really is to support them, and that's why you're having this conversation.
Oh, nice. Oh my goodness, I love that. That it's not a lecture, conversation
Yeah.
that's back and
Yeah.
forth that encourages this should be a good interaction. that educators are getting that great interaction. So
Yeah.
what does that feedback look like for that great interaction? One thing that I learned when I was writing Elevating Equity is to really consider the power dynamics. I actually had never thought about that before. As I'm giving feedback, acknowledge the power differential. I'm like, oh, I'm your friend Angela, but really I'm observing you. And there's hierarchy in this relationship, even though I don't always feel comfortable acknowledging that. So just acknowledge that is there, that someone could feel nervous, that they could feel overwhelmed. Give them their emotional support and be sensitive to the fact that this can't feel uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Also, yeah, giving teachers time to digest feedback. Um, what I would really have loved as a teacher to ask how I would prefer to receive feedback. Is there a preference questionnaire that you can provide? Some people like it just direct, right? And then some people like a softer approach. So feedback should be given in small doses, unfiltered. And you know what? Feedback isn't something to fix, right? It should be strength-based, and the glows always outnumber the grows, and making sure that the educator isn't overwhelmed as they think about areas of.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's so important to also think about the individual, right? So context, like we keep saying, is so important. And we know when we think about professional development, we know that there truly is no one size fits all, right? In each classroom community, there are so many variations in abilities, cultural traditions, environments, interests, languages, needs, and preferences, right? And this is true about the children and the educators of those settings. Like so often we talk about the variations in our children and individualizing, but we hop over the educators and forget sometimes that they also are individuals and have their own preferences, like Dr. Cersei was saying, right? So when we're collecting and using and having conversations about data, we need to remind ourselves that interactions can and should vary across people, right? Like the class data that you see on the paper is only half of the story. And it is our job to contextualize that by considering that specific classroom with those specific children and that specific educator. And then once we consider that full story is when we can fully understand what the data is telling us and how we can truly use it.
Absolutely, absolutely. I love how you made that parallel process so key. In thinking about how, but you know what? I think everyone gets a little nervous around all of this data, but we're already experts at it. Good at observation, thinking about how to individualize is something that we do with children all the time. So being able to pull from that repertoire, be able to use that with adults is so key. And individualizing that experience, I think we even have like a little graphic about how that looks, how it's kind of like a life on a seesaw. I think here. Um,
Yeah.
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 So when we think about individualizing learning experiences and our use of data, sometimes people wonder, how can we improve areas for growth, right? Only by focusing on the strength. And I promise you, there is a way. So think of practices in terms of a seesaw, right? So let's say that there's an educator who implements some effective practices in the classroom, right? So we have those strengths there on the left. Those are the strengths. And then this educator is also experiencing some challenges, which we see on the right as the areas for growth. So in this visual, we see that educators experiencing a lot more challenges. They're feeling like they're having a hard time. They're feeling like there's a lot of areas that they need support. So this right side seems to be heavier. So naturally, we're problem solvers, right? So we want to jump to that heavy side. But let's pause and think about how can focusing on the positive help?
Yes,
So,
absolutely. Absolutely. I love how you're talking about the positivity and how that can lead to more productivity. I love it. Keep going.
yeah.
This is good.
Positivity to productivity. I love that. Um, yeah, so by helping educators reflect on their moments of effectiveness, really unpacking that, really thinking through that, and having a conversation about why was that so effective? When did you notice that you implemented that strategy? And how did the children respond? And why do you think that just worked so well? And helping them think about how to implement those effective practices more often with more children and in more contexts and activities, that side of the seesaw will become heavier. So if you click, you will see that now we have much more on that side and it will become the more impactful side.
Wow,
So
that's so
you
yeah, that's so powerful. I love keep going.
yeah, it's just I know that it seems like not the typical approach, and it seems like I guess it's not our intuition, right? Like, oh well, if we need to address that the right side, then we want to immediately jump to that side. But I mean, think about it with our own lives, right? Like when we really take a moment to reflect on what's going well and what we feel good about and how to expand upon that and have those moments be more present, not just in more frequently during that same time of our days, but across other times of our day, then naturally a lot of those areas where we felt like we were having a hard time with are going to start feeling easier and better, and will start to eventually go away, right? So using a strength-based approach is not only effective at making the better bigger and better and improving practices and outcomes for children, but it's also really helping educators sense of self-efficacy, right? Imagine like feeling like their confidence and their motivation is also growing, and the children are benefiting, and the improvements, right? Those other areas that we still need to talk about that might be lingering and we're still struggling with, that feels a lot more achievable now because we started with the areas where we feel already really good about, and we made those even bigger and wider.
I love what you're saying because it really, well, one, I love the brain. So it fits with brain-based research that we build on the positive and then keep doing that, right? And looking at those glows and see if we can build from there. So, sometimes people worry about it, I know, as you said, but it really is just embrace that process of strength-based.
Yeah, and I want to add too that the way the data can help us learn about what those strengths are, right? It can be, sure, it can be the dimensions that have the highest numbers, right? But it could also be the moments of effectiveness that you as a coach that you've seen in the classroom, even if it wasn't part of a full-on class observation. It could be those moments where you saw that the teacher had a lot of impact on the children, those moments when the children were really, really excited and engaged, right? So it could be about the numbers, but it doesn't only have to be about those numbers to find those strengths, to find those moments that we want to have that we want to increase, right? Like Claudia was saying, more often with more children. How do we increase that impact by focusing our conversations on those moments? And also like both of you were saying, that self-efficacy and that positivity can really help to ensure that educators feel safe and good about the conversations that you're having, so that it's not something, so that coaching isn't something punitive. It's not something that you need because you need help or because you need to improve. Rather, there's all of these wonderful things that are happening, and there's all of this learning that's happening with your children. Let's grow that even more.
Yes, thank you so much for reminding us about that, Dorothy, because we should not feel confined only to the high scores on whatever dimensions that we're seeing on that score sheet in the class, right? Like you, especially as a coach, you know your teachers, you know where they feel comfortable, where they're thriving, and you can use that. That's very, very rich and important data, just as important, if not more, right, as like the numerical stuff that we see on the paper. So please,
Mhm.
please don't forget to go with that, to also have a conversation. And something else really important, Dorothy, that you mentioned is that to ask and have that conversation about and check in with the feelings part. Like so much data, we're focusing on the numerical, the quantitative, right? The objective stuff, but we cannot forget about the feeling aspect. How does this feel? Like, is this even somewhere where you want to start? If you feel more comfortable starting with another area, let's go with that, right? At the end of the day, it's that parallel process, right? If children are not feeling safe and supported and loved, they're not going to have that brain space for that rich, deep thinking. Same thing when we're coaching. If our educators are not feeling supported and connected and safe, they're not going to be able to think about the harder, deeper stuff, right? So please let's not forget about that affective piece.
My goodness. Absolutely, Claudia. I love the idea that emotional support is a launching pad to instructional support. And so, absolutely, they go hand in hand. Nice, nice.
All right. So we've talked a lot about that individual level data, right? When we're talking about just one educator or two educators or just one classroom. But Claudia, you mentioned there's that larger level of the program level. So if you're an administrator and you have program level data, you're really thinking about, okay, I have information about all of my classrooms and a lot of different educators. So those program level reports can help administrators and stakeholders understand how a program is doing as a whole, right? And it can help you provide a shared focus for ongoing professional development, and it can help with some of that decision making. So like we have always been saying, you should also be receiving some kind of description. We're thinking about the class, right? So the class program level data reports, you should also be receiving a description of how data were collected, of the information on the time frame, on how the classrooms were chosen, right? The number of classrooms that were observed, how many cycles happened, right? Was it just 2 cycles across a morning? Was it 4 cycles across a morning? Who your observers were, what their experiences were in observing, a family childcare setting or center-based care or a public preschool or observing in Montessori classrooms. So there's a lot of different ways to examine program level data and break it down so that we can evaluate the effectiveness of your professional development initiatives.
Awesome, awesome. It's thinking about those professional development initiatives, thinking about, identifying the changes from fall to spring. Having an accurate comparison is helpful to collect data approximately the same time each year. And then, thinking about, even, taking that data and having a data dialogue is one way to encourage this great conversation with your program and thinking about your professional development. So what's a data dialogue? Type in the chat if you've had a data dialogue. I know, say that 3 times. Data dialogue. So what is it? Having a data dialogue helps you to build your continuous quality improvement system. Okay, what is it? It's a structured process. It just really slows everything down. So a data dialogue, I'll just have it, for example, I've experienced many of them. Type in the chat. You've experienced, tell me your experiences. First time, I have to say I was a little skeptical. I just like, what is this? I just want to see the numbers, people. But it really is, first you start out with like a protocol for your data dialogue. And the first part of that protocol is exploring predictions. Making up, so like, what are you wondering about? What are your questions about this data? Before you even jump into the data, slow it down. We've already talked about how your emotional brain, right? We've talked about emotions and emotional support. And from that brain perspective, that emotional brain reacts before your logical brain. So slowing the process down can really help that logical brain get fired up. So talking about what will this mean for you first? What are your worries about the data? Can activate your knowledge, even the prior knowledge, curiosity, surface assumptions, and even readiness to explore the data. So that's the first part, okay? It's just like writing that down, taking a minute, taking a breath. Then the next part of a data dialogue is that then you're going to observe and be in the observation phase. So let's actually look at the data. Okay, we made some predictions, we've made some wonderings, we're activating that curiosity, and then let's look at it. What are the patterns that you noticed? Maybe highlighting with oh yes, I love highlighters. What a dialogue. So highlighting before you start, what are the patterns that you're noticing in time of day that we've mentioned, or number of children? What are the surprises that you notice? Get some sticky notes. Every teacher loves sticky notes. Start writing this down and dissecting it. And then the last piece is when you actually start making the inferences. You start really analyzing that data and thinking about, what does this mean? What's the meaning behind it? And then the last piece is that now you're making decisions. Now you're ready to think about what are action steps. It's a 4-part process that kind of helps you to be able to digest, right? Reflect, and then make some really good decisions and it unlocks that logical brain in your decision making.
It's so important, Dr. Cersei, what you're saying about slowing down and really taking the time to understand this data and making sure that you're going to get the most out of the story that your data is telling you, right? And there's so much behind it. We say a picture is worth 1,000 words, right? These data points are also worth even more than that because there's so much that you can learn from that. And there's so much that happened in that context. So just like we talked about context for the individual level data, the context still really matters here. So in that process of your data dialogue, you should be considering, okay, what time of year did these observations happen in? Who were the educators that were present? Who isn't present? What was the amount of support that the educators received between my frequent observations? What contexts were observed, right? Were all my observations during a book sharing time? Those scores are going to look different than if all of your observations are happening during a music experience or during a math experience, right? So it's important to understand, even holistically, what is it that you're looking at? What are the stories behind that data? It's important to keep that in mind. And as you're engaging in that data dialogue, don't be afraid to ask your data a ton of different questions, right? That's the whole point of the dialogue. And collaborating with others that are maybe in different roles and can offer different perspectives that can help you understand the data a little bit better. So if you're an administrator and you are not the person who's coaching educators, right? Make sure that you're having these conversations and interrogating the data with that person who is coaching, right? And if you tend to involve your educators in these conversations, the more the merrier, because then they can also help for you to interpret the data before you start making decisions around, okay, what's next, right? So again, those questions like who is included, who's not included, was there a change? Was there an improvement? Did something decrease? Why could that be? What else was happening at the times of our observations? What were our professional development priorities this year, right? What can I learn about the way that I made decisions this year before I start to make a decision for next year, right? And like Dr. Cersei was talking about earlier, what is some of that other data that you can bring in to help you get the full picture of what, for example, here, what these class scores are telling you, right? What's that curriculum data look like? What does that child outcome data look like? So then instead of having, like Dr. Cersei said, a bunch of different meetings or a bunch of different times where you're just looking at one data point, you can look at the full picture together and see how things are connected, right? In the spring, here in this example, we see higher IS scores. Does that mean that between the fall and the spring, what happened there? Were there additional supports given to educators? Were there additional supports given to children? Did anything in the children's outcome scores also change from the fall to the spring, right? So you can start to see those connections and see how your efforts are driving those child outcomes as well. And so when we think about the class, right, and we think about the class CQI system, we always want to make sure that we are working towards that return on our investment, right? And what we all care about here definitely is making sure that our educators feel safe and supported in their educational context, and making sure that the children are learning, are growing, are thriving, and making sure that we can see that progress, right? So when we're talking about class investments, we're talking about helping educators and leaders understand what class is all about and how those interactions and high quality interactions are really the important element of children's classroom experiences, right? And so there's different levels of knowledge that we can build depending on our program, depending on our capacities. We can also have observers in our program. We can also have all kinds of different class-based professional development. And so that can help us see lots of improvements, because class provides that shared language that can center your program's culture around what matters most for those children's experiences, which are those effective interactions. So that shared language and that transparency around what is it that we're doing as a program? What is our focus? What are our goals? What are we going to make sure that we're doing? What are those success indicators, right? The more transparent we are with educators and our other staff about what it is that we're focusing on, the more that we can all work together and collaborate to make those things a reality. And the more open we are, the more supported educators feel, right? We know that retention is a huge priority for early childhood programs. So we want to make sure that we're promoting that shared language so that we can help with retention. And employee satisfaction surveys are another kind of data point that you can use, right? Are you, like Dr. Searcy said, are you providing those avenues for your educators to give you feedback and give you data on what they're experiencing, what they need, and how you can better support them? And so then other results that we might see when we invest in focusing and measuring and improving is those improved interactions, right? So we can compare scores over time, and you can measure the results of your class-based professional development by collecting data over time. And then most importantly, we can look forward to improved child outcomes the more that we focus together on improving those effective interactions. We know from over 200 studies that focusing on the class can help drive those child outcomes.
Yes, that's right, Dorothy. There are really over 200 research studies that have demonstrated that children in classrooms with more effective teacher-student interactions, as measured by the class, make gains in areas that are so critical for success in school and just in life generally, right? So we always must remember that at the end of the day, effective interactions impact children, right? So the class data that you collect can help you understand your return on investment, like Dorothy was explaining, but the impact goes beyond that program level data, right? It really supports children's math and literacy gains, right? Like performance on math problems for so many years later down their life, like through middle school, through high school. I mean, we are supporting their attachment and their ability to form connections and relationships with others and reduce problem behaviors, like Dr. Searcy was talking about in her research, right? The reduction of referrals, which is just amazing. Their cognitive gains, like their ability to have that flexible thinking and deep thinking and analytical skills and apply that throughout their lives. And of course, their increased enthusiasm for learning and just overall approach to how they think about and approach learning, right? Positive engagement at school with their educators, with their peers, and their involvement and attitude overall. So, I mean, when we think about the power that we have, it can be a little overwhelming, right? Because it's like, oh my goodness, we have such an impact on the children that we serve that it can be overwhelming at times to think about that. But it's such a positive um positive thing that we hold in our hands, and that we use data to help us make more intentional, high quality decisions around our interactions and in the supports that we're providing our educators so that ultimately they can provide that and show up for our children, right? So it's really important for us to keep making this connection and not lose the forest for the trees, right? Especially when we're coaching educators, that we all share the same goal. We're all here for the same reasons. We're all, every single thing we do in our day to day, whether even like that pesky paperwork that we have to get through, right? Like at the end of the day, it's for providing children with positive experiences that support their growth and development. And if you want to learn a little bit more about this research on child outcomes, um, you can check out teachstone.com/research. I'm sure my colleagues will put that in the chat. And there's lots of great information there about that.
All right, so we have a little time now for any questions. So if there's anything that you want to ask anybody on our panel, go ahead and either drop it in the chat or ask us in the Q&A section. I've seen a number of you ask about the recording. We will be sending that out tomorrow, as well as a lot of the resources that were mentioned today. So links to the research page, the slides, you'll get your certificate of attendance. Somebody just asked if they could get a copy of the chat. We can look into providing that, or at least some of the ideas that were presented there. Somebody asked if we have an example or template of a survey that I can give to teachers as a coach to get live feedback or to get feedback on practice. Does anybody have any advice there?
Well, I am working on my author page for Elevating Equity. So I do plan to have some more of the ideas that I mentioned today, like the preferences questionnaire. It's coming. It's coming. It'll be a free download. So just look for that coming soon. Yeah. Yeah, good question.
Any other questions?
I see one here that is asking if comments were all positive, but our scores are low, like average scores are low. How do we coach our teachers? And so thanks for bringing that up, right? Because sometimes we're like, ooh, where do I start if this is sort of not what I expected to see, right? So there's an exercise that I tried out when I was coaching. And I think that, like Claudia was saying, the scores are sort of half the story. So if it's possible for you to go in and observe, conduct an informal observation, you try looking out only for effective moments and writing only effective moments down. So when I first tried this, I went into a classroom and tried to force myself to only write down the positive things that I saw. And I will say that I struggled to not write down everything, right? I had a lot of opinions and a lot of thoughts, and I wanted to write down all of these things, but I forced myself to really look for those effective moments. And then using those scores, using the information that I had from the observation and those effective moments, putting that information together helped me understand the educator's context a little bit better, so that when I went in for a conversation with the educator, we could start with, these are the effective moments I noticed today. Are there other things that stood out to you today? And then maybe we can reflect together on that observation. Okay, in that observation, do you remember the day that you were observed? What did you feel good about that day? Is there something that the children did really well that surprised you? Is there something that you felt like you were particularly impactful in. And so even if the teacher's scores are low, you can use those effective moments to say, let's say the educator is really good at connecting with her children and making them feel really safe and welcome in the classroom. How can we promote those connections maybe during other times that are more instructional, right? How can we promote those continued connections during book sharing? Does that mean asking more questions? Does that mean providing more opportunities for children to share their own thoughts and ideas, right? So you can use those things that the educator it feels really great about. You can use them at different times of the day and help the educator plan for more of those times so that even though the scores were low and maybe it's not something obvious that's standing out to you, conduct your own observation, ask the teacher questions, and then you'll be able to find sort of that strength that you can start from.
Yeah, and something really interesting that happens, right, Dorothy, is that, and from our experiences, that many times when you open the floor and you ask those questions, like, is there anything else that you noticed? The teachers will be the ones to bring up some areas that they are having a hard time with or that they want to talk to you about. So, A, how powerful that that came from them and not you.
Yeah.
And then B, you can then say, okay, let's talk about that and use those notes that you took from that exercise that you said, Dorothy. Like, okay, well, I noticed that, you know, you like really like effectively did this, and the children responded in a great way during this time. How can we use that to tackle that challenge that you're telling me about, right? So it's a great approach, and you'll be surprised at the result.
Yes, yes, I would even add to that. I love what you're saying, and even tying it to a question about this challenging behaviors. And sometimes I'll ask teachers to look at what went well, that they're just focusing on what went wrong. And that sometimes may lead you to maybe not getting into the problem solving that you need to do around challenging behaviors. So I know there was a question about that. I, in terms of challenging behaviors, class is the intervention. It there is chock full of strategies like being in close proximity to a child and reading their cues. Misbehaviors also often like a misread of a child's cues. So I would say dig in to the, and into class and really look at it as like, how can I implement this to have a quality interaction will lead to you having less challenging behaviors. So thinking about it that way can be helpful.
Yeah, and I just want to answer one last thing that somebody asked about announcing observations versus not. I would say, in the context of coaching, I would absolutely recommend having a conversation with the educator about and agreeing on when it is that you're going to go observe. That builds trust, that builds connection. Of course, when we're talking about observations more formally for the purposes of compliance or something that is scheduled from an outsider's uh, perspective, then that's different. But for the purposes of coaching, if you can both agree, you and the teacher decide on when you're coming to observe, that's best practice.
So we are getting to the end of our time. We just wanted to quickly plug two books from Dr. Searcy. First is Push Past It, A Positive Approach to Challenging Classroom Behaviors, and then Elevating Equity. And we can drop those links in the chat. We also have another upcoming webinar pretty soon. This one will be a demo, so no certificate there, but a lot of helpful information on My Teachstone. So we mentioned that reporting is available in My Teachstone that allows you to create consistent and quality data reports that drive quality improvement initiatives. And this demo will walk you through how how Teachstone's subscription to My Teachstone will allow you to capture data easily and create consistent and quality data reports, and help you support your data-driven coaching and learning. So if you want like a really, really easy way to look at the data that you receive and your observations, we'll be going into how My Teachstone can do that on April 12th, and you can register online. We hope that you connect with us, and you can use this code here to get involved with the class learning community. A lot of you talked about how great the conversation was and how helpful it was to have this chat going. The class learning community is just like that. It's a place where you can chat with one another, ask each other questions, and use what you've learned to help each other out, as well as get help from people from Teachstone who can give you really great information. So we're at the end of our time, but we want to say thank you so much, and we hope that you connect with us to keep this conversation going. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.